Good morning. My name is Ron Ripple. I'm the Vice President for Conferences, and welcome to this morning's dual plenary session dealing with, if I flip this over and get the right title again, liquid fuels and transportation. We have three excellent speakers to talk to us through discussions about where transportation may, where it is now, where it may be transitioning. What I'm planning on doing is I'm going to give a very, very brief intro of all three before we get started. As I think Pierre-Olivier and others have noted, you've got the full bios for them online that you can go and check out. Most of them are probably familiar to you anyhow from this conference and others. We're going to go in the order that was that's in the program. So we're going to start Adam Sieminski. Adam is currently the president of KAPSARC in Saudi Arabia. He's been a very active participant in USAE, IAE activities for a long time. Prior to KAPSARC, he was at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and then he was also, for 5 years, the administrator of the EIA in the US. And then following Adam, and Adam is basically going to give us an overview of transportation, liquid fuels, and where we may see that going. He'll be followed by Denis Arguin. Denis is a vice president project development at Enerkem. He also has 30 plus years in the industry, leading the development of many projects in the energy chemical space, and he will be talking to us about the role of biofuels in transportation. And then we'll have Sagar Kancharla, who's going to, he's the economics lead and of advisory services at WSP Canada. And Sagar is going to talk to us about the role of electrification in transportation. Each of them will have about 20 minutes to speak, and then we'll hold questions to the end unless there's some really burning question at the end of their presentation. And that will give us then about 30 minutes for Q&A and discussion about where transportation is heading in our energy space. All right, and with that, I will sit back down and turn it over to Adam.
Bonjour, good morning, salam alaikum. I'm delighted to be here. What a beautiful city, Montreal. I'm particularly pleased to be here in the summer. The first trip I made to Montreal, and every other time I've been to Montreal, was in the dead of winter. And it's cold. It's cold here, and this change of weather is just absolutely delightful. I went to university at Cornell in Ithaca, New York, and as far as I know, I'm sure there's more, and people are going to raise their hands and tell me, but the city of Montreal, McGill, and probably I'm sure here at HEC as well, Cornell and Dartmouth have winter festivals to try to break up that. And the engineers are always participating in that. So it's a great thing. Let me just jump right into this. I think I've got about a dozen slides here. I'm going to try to go through them pretty quickly. And there's a lot of information on these slides. I mean, I could spend literally the entire 20 minutes that I have on one slide. I'm not going to do that. But let me spend a little bit of time on this one. This is kind of an overview of the slides. Oil is currently the primary fuel in transportation. It's more than 90% of transportation fuels. And the conclusion is it's probably going to stay that way, at least out to 2040. I think there is a possibility. There's been a lot of talk about the potential for a peak in oil demand That's possible, but there are a lot of drivers, particularly in the transportation and chemicals demand. We won't get into that here, but in petrochemicals that could drive oil demand continuing to move up, including things like growth in the middle class, so growth in global GDP and urbanization, and urbanization generally tends to drive energy demand up. Autonomous vehicles, as well as shared mobility. I know a lot of people have been getting back and forth between the Delta Hotel and here using Uber. In the Middle East, where I'm currently living, there's a firm called Careem that just got bought by Uber, and it's a big model there as well. There are alternatives to oil. The biggest one actually right now is biofuels. There was a little bit of talk about biofuels yesterday and kind of the energy in, energy out associated with biofuels. I've always been, even though I'm an engineer, I'm much more persuaded by using economic criteria, dollar value, dollars in and dollars out, than I am by energy in and energy out. That's a further discussion. Natural gas vehicles also have a fairly decent market share. The big one that everybody's interested in, and this is what's driving this whole idea of autonomous vehicles and shared mobility, I think, is electric vehicles. And could electric vehicles and battery technology improve enough to take market share away from internal combustion engines? So the challenge is it's kind of slow going. There are a lot more internal combustion engine vehicles in transportation than there are electric vehicles, and we'll go through a little bit of that. So yes, electric cars are coming. Will they completely replace the internal combustion engine fueled by oil? Probably not in my lifetime, which I hope is, maybe I get another 20 years. As they say, where I'm coming from now, inshallah. That means God willing. I haven't learned how to say in Arabic yet the phrase that I learned growing up, God willing and the creek don't rise. Flooding. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this, this chart. On the left-hand side is all of energy consumption, and then you can see the share of transportation in energy consumption, which is, call it 30%. The breakdown of that, light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, aviation, maritime, and then let's look at how transportation is fueled, and that's the third and the fourth graphs. And what you can see is it's overwhelmingly oil. Yes, there is a little bit of electricity, a little bit of natural gas, and so on, but it's largely oil. And if you look at the oil portion of that, it's largely going into light-duty vehicles. Light-duty vehicles, so that's, again, the opportunity set for electric is in light-duty vehicles. It's probably not going to be in heavy-duty trucks. And in my lifetime, I'm going to, it's like, one of the things that Ron didn't say, I'm a chartered financial analyst, and one of the first things we learned is in taking the CFA exam is never provide a guarantee. You can't guarantee anybody anything. That's okay, I'm going to break the rule. I'm going to guarantee you that there's not going to be any electric planes flying large payloads around the world in my lifetime. Rail, rail was interesting. When I was at EIA in 2013, when oil prices were very high, we were looking at the possibility that of LNG and natural gas in maritime applications, heavy-duty trucks, and trains. So we'll see where that goes. So now we're going to, again, look at transportation. How much is rail, maritime, road, aviation, and within road, heavy-duty and light-duty vehicles. So that's kind of a schematic. And so the whole point of this slide, and I'm going to stop looking at this one in 5 seconds, is what we're going to be looking at today is mostly that box with the red dotted line around it, light-duty vehicles. Some of the issues associated with light-duty vehicle and technological drivers, the graph on the left-hand side is fuel economy. The dots are standards for new cars. The lines are average fuel economy. You see it's growing over time. So fuel economy and engine performance is going to be a big driver in light-duty vehicle consumption, weight reduction. I can remember, actually one of the first studies that I did as an analyst back in 1973 was looking at the possibility of how much glass and paint added to the weight of a vehicle. And if you could find a way to reduce the weight of the glass and the amount of paint needed to paint a car, you could actually get better fuel economy. This was right after the big rise in oil prices in 1973, so 74. Aerodynamic improvements, improvements in tire friction, it's always been a big thing. Energy management software. People at Aramco, Saudi Aramco, are looking at a lot of these things. They're particularly looking at the possibility for improvements in engine technology. So this slide gets into the idea of autonomous vehicle uptake. So one of the things, and I didn't use it here, but I've got a graph that borrows two graphs, one from the International Energy Agency in Paris and another from the BP outlook, energy outlook. And the graph from the, and think about it this way, the graph from the IEA shows this huge, huge uptake in autonomous and electric vehicles. And it's going from virtually nothing to 300 million cars, and you kind of go, wow, that is like really impressive. Then you look at how many cars are actually on the road, what the car park is, and the answer is in the, way over. It's more than 1 billion now, and it's going to be 2 billion in 2040. And what that says is that yes, electric vehicles are growing very, very rapidly, but the number of underlying vehicles that you've got to replace that are internal combustion engines and might be replaced with internal combustion engines is really big. And with autonomous vehicles, there are some questions, and it's on slide 7 that we get to, is actually most of the academic work done on autonomous vehicles and shared mobility is nobody's quite sure whether that's going to increase the demand for energy for those vehicles or decrease the demand. It's kind of Jevons paradox. You find some way to lower the costs associated with transportation, and what you find is that there's higher demand for that transportation. So these are the questions that I thought were worth looking at. And again, you see the underlying base of oil vehicles in a lot of the forecasts. So it's not just Exxon Mobil's forecast, and it's not just the EIA or the IEA. Even if you take the Bloomberg New Energy forecasts and show what they mean and take the highest number of vehicles that are going to be coming from electric, it's still relatively low. What are the questions that you have? How is urbanization and economic growth going to affect demand for those vehicles, improvements in fuel economy, penetration of other fuels like biofuels, natural gas vehicles, shared mobility, and autonomous driving? There are still a lot of issues out there for you young energy researchers to find something interesting in there and make a career out of it. I think you could probably be talking about these issues for the next 25 years. This one basically says, look, I'm beginning to repeat here, but even in the biofuels area, there is a lot of growth. There are a lot of places where biofuels are favored. We do know in the United States, Donald Trump was actually, there were a couple of people that early on in the campaign, 3-4 years ago, people were talking about doing something in terms of the subsidies for biofuels in the U.S., but they're still on, and with the Iowa primary in the U.S., you're still going to have, I think, a lot of support for 1 million barrels a day, roughly, of ethanol demand in the U.S. Brazil is also really big on this. There was some interesting discussion yesterday about whether this makes sense or not. I do know that there was some work at Cornell University, maybe 5 years ago, some time ago, basically saying that it was really close whether you were saving a lot of energy with biofuels or not, and even carbon dioxide. If you do it, wheels to, from tractor planting to making the biofuel itself. This one I think is again kind of interesting. Alternate fuels and especially electric vehicle uptake. To me, when you look at the right-hand side, behavior, policy, technology, and economics, I think the one that's going to make the biggest difference is technology. If somebody figures out a battery, then not only will electric vehicles make a lot more sense, but wind and solar are going to become much more useful too, because of the ability to store economically the power generated when you don't need it and use it when you do need it. But there are a lot of interesting, I think, opportunities for change here. Changes in terms of policy that could be either positive or negative for electric vehicles. Are you going to continue with the tax subsidies or not? And on the technology side with batteries. Yeah, compressed gas, and I think Ron just said I got 5 minutes, and I think I'm almost actually at the end of the slides. 2 more slides. Compressed gas, liquid propane gas, so propane and compressed natural gas kind of sharing that market, but you can see at the bottom how much that represents of the total transportation demand, and it's interesting, but it's not enough to drive the system. So again, natural gas vehicles will grow. There are certainly opportunities in places like North America and maybe even in India, but it may not. It just doesn't have the same infrastructure. It doesn't have, it has the same infrastructure issues associated with electric vehicles. Where are you going to get the fuel for your natural gas vehicle? So it works really good for fleets, but fleets, generally speaking, aren't light-duty vehicles. Fleets generally tend to be heavy-duty vehicles where you might have more room for tankage anyways. So 96% of heavy-duty vehicle demand is oil. It's diesel fuel and gasoline. And that's going to be hard to replace because of scheduling and refueling issues associated with freight transportation. So this one, road transportation forecasts. This is kind of looking at a different scenarios, Shells, BPs, the IEAs, and let me just summarize this for you. Across all of these forecasts, there are opportunities for changes in fuels in all of these sectors, but oil is still playing an important role in all of them. So now I seem to be stuck. I wonder if I hit the wrong key here. I can't get to my last slide.
Bonjour, good morning. My name is Denis Arguin. I'm with Enerkem. It's a young company, so it's going to be a different angle from what Adam just presented, but it fits well into the energy line. This is probably a slide that when you talk about energy, you don't see too often, where we combine solid waste, which is a large market, which has already its infrastructure of supply, but most of it goes into a landfill. And one of the things that Enerkem is looking at is to turn that waste into fuel. We all know about the transportation fuel. It's a huge market, but there's also the circular chemical, that is a growing market with a lot of, I will say, public and government incentive going toward that direction. So this is rather new, but it's going to follow the biofuel route. At least that's what we believe. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, there's about 2 billion tons per year of waste that are being produced. And of this, 30% is either recycled or it goes into composting. So that's only 30%. So that means there's another 70% that are mostly going to landfill. Some of it goes to incineration. And with the technology that we have, we can turn this waste into a feedstock for biofuels or circular chemical production. So I'll talk a bit more of this. As far as the market, Adam mentioned, the biofuel. There's a lot of debate between, biofuel and food competition. Obviously, taking the waste, we're not in that mode. It's a large market. It's a growing market. There's a lot of incentive, and I'll talk about it. But as Adam indicated as well, in the US, it takes half of the volume of ethanol for biofuel in the world. So it's a growing market, and there's a higher demand coming every year. I'll go quickly on the mandates, but those are quite important for new companies and transition fuels because obviously the economic of those technology, when you start a new technology, you cannot compete with refining that's been there for 100 years. So you need to get on the market. So those mandates are important to help us guarantee supply. In Canada, it's quite well aligned. It's a 5% renewable fuel standard on gasoline and 2% on diesel. Different provinces have different approach. British Columbia is more aggressive. It's mirroring itself to his southern friend in California, and California is always ahead in North America. Quebec doesn't have a mandate, but they're working toward that, and we wish them quite a bit of success. In the US, there's the Fuel Quality Directive, Renewable Energy Directive, and there's every year those are being adjusted, and there's a growth going there. There's a lot of push toward the second generation biofuels. So again, try to avoid competition with the food availability. So again, this helps a company like us and other companies that are coming on the market to ensure there's a room for them to come in and make some space for biofuel. In those, you got California here, obviously, USA, Oregon. Sorry, I'm going to go back here. Yeah, in Europe, it's the leader presently. They come out with the Renewable Energy Directive 2 that will span from 2022 to 2030. And it's very aggressive in the growth of biofuel. Very aggressive in the growth of next generation biofuels. They also open the door to renewable fuel. So they have a new category. So if you are able to bring fuel that is coming from waste or recycled material, this is an approved fuel. So they're growing that. And at the same time, they're capping the production of first generation biofuel. So this has changed drastically obviously the interest or the attention of the big oil and gas company, because now it's real and they're going to have obligation that they have to meet. So it's very helpful when you go for project development. As I indicated, in the US, California is driving the show with being very aggressive, but also very successful. Obviously, there's huge incentive in the biofuel world, and they put a lot of emphasis on biofuel that has the lowest carbon intensity, which I think is the right thing to do, is to reduce the greenhouse gas effect. So very stringent and very demanding, but with very high incentive. So it's a very exciting market, and they're leading the way. So we expect that some sort of, I guess, derivative of this will happen in the rest of the world. So quickly, Enerkem at a glance. It's a small company, 200 employees. We're based here in Montreal, it's our head office. Most of the technology development has been done south of here, about 100 kilometers in Sherbrooke. And we have our first commercial operation in Edmonton, Alberta, where we have, we're taking municipal solid waste and turning it into biofuels. We can produce biofuels, we can produce chemicals, obviously we can produce syngas. We are an alternative to landfill and incineration. In fact, we are the second stage of recycling, so you get all the mechanical recycling that is doing well but can do better, is improving, but it has all its limitations, so we are the next phase of recycling. And just to give an idea, to bring this company where we are now, we spent over $750 million to bring that technology to market. So it takes a lot of good partners, and we're very blessed by having those partners. But this is one of the tipping point. Money is always a tipping point. As far as our solution, we're feedstock flexible. So being a Canadian, Quebec company, obviously all this work started from wood biomass. This is where the development of the technology started. But it became very clear that if we're able to transform waste into fuel or syngas or chemical, it gives us a big advantage because you have all this existing infrastructure of waste. So we've developed this technology to be able to do that. So now we can go from 100% biomass to 100% plastic and anything in between. So very flexible as a feedstock. The process has been developed in-house, so this is all patented technology, so there's no third-party license. Presently, the two products that we are offering are ethanol, because it's the biofuel of choice in North America. And in Europe right now, there's a lot of demands for methanol, so as a biofuels, but also as a circular chemical. So we're producing that for Europe, and obviously, methanol is the building block for a lot of chemicals and plastic. So just to give you a perspective, this is typically what we do. Typically, we have one train of gasification. We'll take 100,000 tons per year of municipal solid waste or waste. This equates to about a population of about 300,000 to 400,000 people. So this will supply, and we turn that into syngas, and depending of the market, we go to methanol or ethanol. So this is the yield. So quickly, when we go to methanol, from 1 ton of municipal solid waste, we'll produce about 0.8 tons of methanol. When we go to ethanol, it's a little bit lower yield because it's a more demanding process. So this is our aim, recovering carbon and making, contributing to meet the waste management challenge. And what we want to enable as well is to go from a linear economy and then push that into a more circular economy. So taking the post-consumption waste, and one of the things I want to just to clarify, we're taking waste post-recycling, so we're not competing with recycling. So the waste that we take have all gone through the recycling, and when the recycling cannot extract more value out of it, then we take this material. Then obviously we transform that into either chemicals or biofuels, then it goes into either transportation fuel or it goes into other product. If it goes into plastic or other textile, it will go back to the landfill and then turns around. So this is where we promote this circular economy. Quickly on the technology, needs to demystify a little bit the waste management, but for us as a chemical engineer, the way we measure our performance is how much carbon that we have in the waste that we can finalize at the end into our final product. Typically, we're running on municipal solid waste and post-recycling, and there's 3 treatments that we do. One is we reduce the size so that we can go for transportation of this material. Second is we remove as much inert, but there will still be about 10, 15, up to 20% inert in the feedstock, because if you want to go further than that, it doesn't come effective. And where we need, in North America, not necessarily, but in Asia for sure, we need to dry the feedstock, because bringing water into our system just use carbon that we're not able to transform into the biofuel. So typically the feedstock coming to our gasification system is about 10 to 15%, but it can go to 20, 25%. Next step is we do gasification, so it's a bubbling fluidized bed, so we use a mixture of steam and oxygen to bubble the bed, mix the material. We crack all carbon-containing material into a raw syngas. All the inerts, they drop at the bottom of the bed, and they can be used for wood, not wood, but road, paving, etc. It's an inert material. Then as we go in the gasifier, then we adjust the condition to get the right quality of syngas, and mostly the syngas is a combination of hydrogen and carbon monoxide. And then the other trick is obviously to clean the syngas, because I don't think anyone here has a speck on the waste that you're putting in your garbage. Well, when it comes to our plant, that's what we get. So there's going to be lead, arsenic, sulfur, chlorine, etc. So obviously within a range, the process can handle that. So we have an ultra clean syngas that after that we transform into a liquid, first into methanol, and then sometime we stop there, and then methanol to ethanol when we go to that. Or we can go methanol to dimethyl ether, which is something that is going for diesel replacement. The technology is advancing on the engine there. But we also go to acetic acid when needed. Just to give you an idea, this is our first plant, so that was quite a step up for the organization. So Enerkem design, procure, build, and now is operating the plant. But just since about 1 month, we're very fortunate. Suncor has joined Enerkem and is helping us in the operation of the biorefinery. So we're very happy to have them there, because Enerkem is not an operator. Suncor is a large operator, so they're bringing a lot of value for us. This plant has a capacity of 38 million tons per year, liter per year. This is the first generation. The second generation will double in capacity. We're taking 100,000 tons per year of waste material. And as I said, we're producing methanol and ethanol. The interesting part over there is that with the city of Edmonton, they closed the landfill and they turned the landfill into an industrial park. So they have, obviously, all the recycling facility is there. Whatever is not recyclable comes back to us. They're separating the organic from all of the rest, and they're making compost and also making renewable natural gas as well. And also they're receiving all construction demolition. In North America, there's a lot of wood, so all contaminated wood is also sent back to us. Their aim, they're not there yet, but their aim is to divert 90% of the waste from the landfill. So it's quite amazing. Today they are around 65%. As we ramp up our production and they ramp up their operation, we will get there. And one of the beauty of Edmonton is, they have a very good view of organizing that. As I said, they develop into a industrial park. There are now 500 people working on site, so all coming from waste. And it's a good job, and also some of the job are reinsertion from people that cannot really easily get into the working environment. So it's a very good societal approach. One of the things that we've developed as we do that, because we expect to have a lot of projects in the pipeline, so we have standard design and we build all those facilities modularized. So in fact, I'll simplify, but it's kind of a mechano when it gets there. So it's a bunch of modules that we bring on site, and we can assemble, put up a module one per day. So it's a very low risk construction on site, but obviously it takes a lot of engineering. In Edmonton, we started to methanol first, because we know that in Europe this is the market of choice. And in 2016, we were certified by the ISCC, who certify biofuel in Europe. So we were the first company to be certified using waste to make biomethanol. And we had the same thing from the EPA in the British Columbia in 2017, but this is waste to ethanol. Thanks. So we have, as I mentioned, with the new regulation, with the interest from the petrochemical company, the plastic company, obviously the plastic company today are feeling a lot of pressure with the waste plastic in the ocean and everywhere. So there's a lot of interest for recycling capability. So that's where we bring chemical recycling or carbon recycling. As I said, we have our facility in Edmonton, Alberta. We have a project here in Varennes, just across the river, that we're going to start the construction this summer. The next two in line are in Rotterdam and in Barcelona. Rotterdam is an interesting, it's at the port of Rotterdam, right on the water, right at the chemical complex. It's a consortium. We have Air Liquide, we have the Port of Rotterdam, obviously. We have AkzoNobel and Shell as well. And in Barcelona, it's not in Barcelona, it's in Tarragona. Same thing, into an industrial park. And our partner there is Suez, which is one of the largest waste and water treatment company. And this is a very exciting facility where also we're looking at further expand this to specifically plastic recycling. And in this area, we're looking at taking waste plastic, bringing it into syngas, and putting it back, not us, but we'll provide the syngas to the plastic producer, and they'll turn it back into plastic. So this is a project. This is more long-term, but there's a lot of traction on that end. We have two projects in, we're showing only one here, but we have two in the US, one in Minneapolis, and another one in California, which this one is very interesting as well. We're taking orchard tree waste. Those trees needs to be replaced every 20 years. And they don't know what to do with that. Right now they're burning it, open burn, and this area is one of the worst air quality in the world. So we're addressing that. So we're gonna take this orchard waste and turn that into biofuel. And as any company that wants to make business, we're looking at China, but this is a bit further down the line. But Asia has a lot of solid waste issues. They also have a lot of air pollution issue. So we can help them in both directions. So this is a bit where Enerkem is. We believe we can contribute to the transition of energy, and at the same time to improve the recycling of our waste. So, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be a part of this distinguished panel today. The electricity sector and the heating sector contributes significantly to the greenhouse gas emissions. But this sector in the last decade has been making some good progress in terms of handling the sector's emissions. And then when you go down the chain of who's the next biggest emitter, it is the transportation sector. And it's important to have these kind of conversations for the transportation sector to tackle its emissions. The mobility sector is being disrupted in 4 key themes. You have the connected vehicles, you have the autonomous vehicles, you have the shared vehicles, and then you have the electric vehicles. Today I'll talk about the electric vehicles. There's lots of buzz around the electrification of transportation and electrification in general, but transportation definitely. And I'll be talking about the next tipping point here for accelerated adoption of EV. And it is not a slam dunk. I think we heard from Adam as well, but there's lots of uncertainty on the electric vehicle adoption. And that's what I'll be talking about. What are the events that are required to make accelerated adoption of the electric vehicles? First of all, it's good to recognize that at the end of 2018, there are 5 million electric vehicles on the road. That's a significant achievement in the last 5 years' time. And the audience here might be familiar that when you're looking at any technology adoption, you essentially need 4 things. You need the policy support, then you need technological breakthroughs, you need an integrated supply chain, and then of course you need a demand for your product. From that perspective, the electric vehicle has benefited significantly from the policy support. I think not a week passes when we don't hear something from a city, state, or a country announcing some green objectives with their targets. And then you have lots of incentives being given, recognizing the value of the transportation in terms of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions as well. And then you have the EV 30 at 30 campaign going on. Essentially, this is to have 30% market share for electric vehicles by the year 2030. So there is good support from the policy perspective. And from the technology perspective as well, if you look at the typical battery technology which is used for these electric vehicles is the lithium-ion technology. And in the last decade or so, with technological improvements as well as the economics of scale, the prices have been declining significantly. So there's also support from the technology side. And when you look at the supply perspective, the number of announcements that the automakers are making in terms of the electric vehicle introduction is astounding. Many of the automakers have released or plans to release multiple electric vehicle models across all segments as well. And they soon, I think the number of automakers announcing is so significant, this industry will see some shakeup and not in the distant future. All these 3 themes, the policy, the technology, and the supply, have contributed to this growth in electric vehicles. But then if you really look closely at the 5 million vehicles on the road, and you discount for the vehicles in Norway and China, then you'll see that it is in the rest of the world, the electric vehicles have been adopted by the early adopters, essentially. And then you think why there is this hesitancy for accelerated adoptions when you have good policy, technology, and supply helping the electric vehicle adoption. So there are many forecasts available right now, and the most optimistic is the Bloomberg forecast, and then you have the most conservative is the US Energy Information Administration. So I just picked up the international agencies, International Energy Agency forecast for their EV 30 at 30 scenario. But all these forecasts kind of agree that we are at the foot of the S-curve. There's lots of significant growth expected in the electric vehicles as well. And the economists in this forum are fully aware of all the forecast models, especially the diffusion curves and all the S-curves. Here I've picked up Jeffrey Morse adoption cycle to really understand why the hesitancy of adoption of electric vehicles. As familiar with the Jeffrey Morse, after the early adopters, there is this chasm that he talks about, or some other frameworks talk about the valley of death. I think that's what the electric vehicles is also facing here. The chasm is really the range anxiety for electric vehicles. This range anxiety could come from the lack of charging infrastructure, or it could be the range capacity, or it could be the time it takes for charging an electric vehicle. And many a time I wonder, maybe it's just a behavioral issue more than any of this concept, because if you think about the current technology and you think about the average commute that most of us do, the technology is sufficient to do your daily commute, come back home and charge. But still there is a range anxiety that we need to address. And full disclosure, I'm one of them. I don't own an electric vehicle, and being a single car family, I'm waiting for my car to come to its end of the life, probably it'll be a year or two, and plan to replace with an electric vehicle. But you can say these kind of scenarios exist from the range anxiety, and you need to address that. And the way to look at it is really at the infrastructure, that the existing infrastructure and what is required for the electric vehicles adoption to accelerate. The charging infrastructure, and if you really look at very simplistically from the various components that's required for charging your electric vehicle, there is this typical utility, traditional utility infrastructure. It could be vertically integrated or pure utilities at the distribution level, but you still have the generations, transmission, distribution, and then ending at the meter. That's the utilities role. And then for EV, you have this make-ready infrastructure so that you have components that would enable you to have the charging equipment. So finally, there's charging equipment. So you could break it up into three areas of how the infrastructure is. And then there are also these pyramids of where the charging takes place as well. So you have chargers at home, and then you have work, then you have at public places as well. And when you go up the pyramid, it's basically the separation from the ownerships of the charger, and the expenditure to maintain them increases as well. So all this have a role in terms of where and how you charge your electric vehicles. Right now, across the globe, and I think yesterday when I was in few of the concurrent sessions related to electric vehicles, seems to be that this issue is prevalent across the globe. It's not just a North American globe when it comes to the charging infrastructure setup. Right now, the cities, the utilities, private companies, everybody is kind of scrambling to have a role in developing this infrastructure. I think my perspective is that if you really want to have accelerated EV adoption, you need to have local clarity on the infrastructure development. And again, coming with the theme of this conference of local energy and global markets, I don't expect there will be one global model for EV infrastructure. It really depends on the local needs of how the infrastructure gets developed. But one of the key players, I'll get into more details, that they can add significant value are the utilities. Why I say that is, think about the utilities are very familiar with electrical infrastructure development. They know the commodity well. They know the wires, poles, and other equipment very well. They know the customers as well. Who is in a better position to help with the infrastructure than the utilities themselves? And there is very significant value that they can provide in terms of the coverage that the utilities provide. Even to underserved or unserved areas, utilities can provide charging infrastructure as well. And if you're looking for an accelerated rollout based on your local green objectives, they can definitely help with your acceleration of the rollout as well. And there's always a concern about competition and getting into regulation. But there is this regulatory compact that all the utilities work on. They're a regulatory body overseeing the operations. And like any other investments, they need to make the cost-benefit analysis. And you have various tests. It could be the ratepayer impact test, or it could be the cost-benefit test, or it could be the societal impact test. Regulators insist on all these tests for making these investments. And with the scale of economies that the utility, you can see a decreasing in price in the volumetric charges as well. And if there is clarity for the utilities that they can play a role, they can bring in additional value to the whole infrastructure. And I'm just not talking about only for the electric vehicle. You're talking about the whole electric grid, including the generation and the delivery networks. They can help with the load shifting and peak shaving. aspects by creative pricing of how electricity is used at what time of the day. Similarly, we keep hearing about negative pricing and about the duck curves. And here too, I think once the utilities can play a role by ensuring with some pricing of how the excess generated power is put to good use here. There are more value-added processes and programs. For example, the vehicle-to-grid program that can be implemented where vehicles' batteries can be used as storage resources. There is also a thought that because of the stringent standards for cars compared to the regulated storage, the used batteries after the vehicles have used can be repurposed for regular storage works as well. So my thought is there is a role for utilities as well as with the competition. And you can think about various models in the infrastructure of the utilities. Here in Hydro-Quebec, they're running a pilot where Hydro-Quebec plays a role across the value chain. And then you have the California where 2 of the 3 utilities, going back to my graphic, the regulators have allowed a recovery for make-ready infrastructure investments for the California utilities. And then you have Ontario, the province of Ontario, where it is still the traditional utility and the infrastructure is being developed by the private companies. And in some jurisdiction across the globe, the cities are getting involved in the investments for the charging infrastructure. So the models are all over the place, but there is a role for utilities and private organizations to play a role. The public utilities can provide the critical infrastructure up till the make-ready infrastructure, and then the charging equipment could be done by the competition. I'm not saying this is the only role, but you could play, but let's not underestimate the investment is required even when it's opened for competition. When you look at the corner gas station, the power that goes in for that, it's good to store the lights and run the motors. Maybe it can handle 50 kW of charging infrastructure. But when you're looking at the top of the pyramid of 150 kW and 6 superfast chargers, the existing utility infrastructure needs to be upgraded. So if you're making that upgrade, why can't the utilities just go one more distance and have this make-ready infrastructure and build the necessary infrastructure for electric vehicle adoption? And there are other implications. We can't decide on infrastructure decisions based on current information. You need to be cognizant of some of the trends that we are seeing here. There could be a situation where you have more of this connected and autonomous vehicles and coming home for a charging base. And there are already lots of incentives for the cities to have where maybe only for the core downtown area, the internal combustion engine vehicles are not allowed to come as well. And that's moving towards that. And there is also a lot of this goes back to my behavioral economics side. There are lots of programs to move the consumer behavior through nudging, through education and awareness as well. We need to be cognizant of infrastructure, taking into considerations some of the other developments that are happening where organizations are trying to differentiate themselves from their competition. For example, employees would have workplace charging infrastructure to retain their workforce and provide incentives to have workplace charging, free workplace charging. Even the retailers, right now we see them, and as well, there is a kind of a privileged parking spots in some of these malls as well. The retailers could be providing more of that to attract customers. And maybe you'd have multi-residential developments where the governments might make it mandatory to have EV infrastructure at the development stage itself. You might have some fleet operators having fleet just to meet their sustainability objectives, having only electric vehicles as well. The hotels and other destination places, the airports and hotels, could also, based on the sustainability objectives, could have fleet of electric vehicles. So all these developments and trends will have implications on your energy infrastructure. And it is really important to take a long-term perspective. And maybe the pyramid which you saw, a big source of charging is currently at residences, could get inverted where there's more public charging and less at home, especially with the increased urbanization that's happening globally as well.
We have about 5 minutes now.
Yeah, thank you. So if all what I said has happened, there are going to be some implications for the other transportation fuels. You heard from Adam and as well on the other fuels what is likely to happen on the high carbon fossil fuels. My perspective here is similar, is that there is still a long lead time for electric vehicle adoptions. But more and more announcements coming where the cities are either banning internal combustion engines or announcing very stringent emission standards, you would see gradual displacement of the ICEs. And the other thing that's happening is even the the ICEs are getting efficient as well. So two things could happen, where they get efficient or they get displaced, the high carbon fuels. And then when you look at the low carbon fossil fuels, like the natural gas, this is an interesting position. And I think in North America, you have such excess supply and low prices for natural gas. It is difficult to ignore that fuel as a source. And as much people call it as a bridge, it really requires for natural gas to flourish a Goldilocks scenarios. You don't want to have too strong carbon policies or too low carbon policies as well. But I can see the natural gas being utilized as a compressed natural gas or liquid natural gas for medium to heavy trucks. On the highways, you can have LNG trucks flying over as well. But the natural gas is in unique positions where it could be a fuel for transportation, or with so much of electrification talk, it could become as a source as well for power generation. So that's a transition we might see as well, with coal plants being closed down, and I think U.S. had some record natural gas power generation happening in the last recent years as well. And then you have this no carbon fuels, and here also renewable natural gas is getting lots of prominence. Then you heard from biofuels as well, and then probably the hydrogen technology as well. There still needs some technological developments on the hydrogen side. But these no carbon also would find some niche markets for transportation as well. And probably the graph is not visible here, is the scenario that IEA projects by 2030 is 15% market share for EVs. It seems like a low number, but it's a lot of fleet that they're replacing, even 15% globally. Bloomberg has more optimistic number. By 2040, they expect 50% market share for electric vehicles. If we're really concerned about this accelerator and we want to meet those targets, I think we need to address this infrastructure development with a sense of urgency. So just some couple of takeaways from my presentation today is the first of all, GHG management. The electricity sector is doing a good job. Now it's the turn of the transportation sector to address the emissions. All the stakeholders need to come together and really look at the local needs and plan together of how the infrastructure will get developed. Utilities can play a role because they know how to build infrastructure. You can involve competition like the California model, where you can have a EV make-ready infrastructure and then have charging equipment for the competition. And finally, if all these are met, and I think the path for the fuels is that they either get displaced or reduced to be as a bridge fuel or find some niche markets as well. So those are my 5 takeaways from today's conversation. Just quickly, this is the organization I work with. The WSP is a global professional services organization providing strategic and technical services. I'm with the advisory services group. we have power and transportation business lines working together in developing some of the infrastructure side. We did some good work for the London charging infrastructure, as well as lots of progress. There seemed to be more adoption and acceptance on the electric buses. So we've done some pilots in Halifax, in Alberta, in Peru as well, and a few other areas as well. So that's about the organization. But just to end, I think to the title of my slide, having what's the next tipping point for electric vehicles, it is really the local clarity on charging infrastructure that's needed for accelerated electric vehicle adoption. Thank you.
Thank you, Sagar. All right, we have 20 minutes or so for questions. There are microphones halfway back there, which is pretty much behind where everyone is sitting.
Bring it forward.
It's good for exercise.
Pick it up and carry it up there.
Yeah, Andrea, why don't you drag one of those forward if it's not nailed down? And please tell us who you are, who you're with, and then your question, please. Oh, okay, another technical issue. Is that going to, is it working over there?
Now it's working. My name is Andrea Bolino, professor of economics. I couldn't agree more with I have two questions, very short. I couldn't agree more with the last speaker. I live in the center of Rome, where we have something like 4,000 to 5,000 inhabitants per square kilometers and the same number of cars. So how do you see in those old urban structure the idea of developing the infrastructure? So far, the Italian utility has put in the best parking spot a recharging area so that I cannot park my car there anymore. And I'm angry, of course, about that idea. Because those who have an electric car use that as a free parking while I continue to get parking tickets because I do not have my parking area. Okay, so that's one complaint as a citizen. The second question is that I didn't hear any word, or maybe I was distracted, about hydrogen as another source of alternative fuels for vehicles. Is this something that has completely been abandoned or can continue to be part of the agenda?
I can start and maybe thanks for reinforcing my thought of through your complaint. And I think the local authorities need to do need to really focus a lot on infrastructure development. With the increased urbanization, I think it is really important. And I think there's so much focus, as I said, on the automakers and the side that we are moving so fast on a couple of themes on the electric vehicles, but we are forgetting the infrastructure. I think that's really important that the utilities and others need to work together. That's my answer there. When it comes to hydrogen, my perspective is that, I briefly touched on, sorry, I didn't expand on that. It is really further away. I think the energy that is required to break up the hydrogen molecules is still prohibitive from a commercial perspective, but it is not to say that it is far away from getting adopted here. And the good thing about the hydrogen when it comes is it can use the natural gas existing networks as well if it comes. But I think right now it's really the technology developments need to have of separating the hydrogen molecules.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. On the hydrogen, I think there's some area that are more in a good position to promote that, because if you want to go to hydrogen in the direction we're going, probably you want to have green hydrogen as well. So a combination of green electricity and being able to produce hydrogen from water, as an example, is something quite exciting. Here in Quebec, we have all the tools to make that happen. On the West Coast as well, in Norway as well, and you see that in China as well. So I think, and as you said, there are infrastructure. The natural gas infrastructure could help on that, but the technology to have it available for cars, it's a few years away, but I think it has a lot of value, a lot of potential.
Adam?
Just very quickly, I think everybody has talked about, Sagar talked about the tipping point being charging infrastructure. It's certainly, it's very hard for almost any fuel, whether it's electricity, hydrogen, or natural gas, to compete with the infrastructure associated with getting gasoline and diesel fuel. And that's why it's actually probably pretty important to have oil companies get involved in this, because if you could have other fuels other than gasoline available at gasoline stations, then you might make some progress. I actually drove the Toyota Mirai natural gas fuel cell vehicle. It's a beautiful car, and it works great, but there's only, in Washington, there's only 2 places to get hydrogen. And the day that I was driving the car, one of those stations, fill-up stations, wasn't working. I mean, that's the issue. I mean, so you're, with electricity, it's a little bit easier. But yesterday, I don't know. I was taking a quick look to see if I could find it on Twitter here, and we could show the picture. But about every other day, I see a picture on Twitter of somebody's extension cord coming out of a townhouse in an urban area, across the sidewalk, and into the car that's parked at the curb. And if you have a suburban house, you can pull up to your garage and get a charge. But if you're in an urban area, it's not easy. And so we're back to, we were actually having an interesting discussion yesterday about, or this morning, for the Paris meeting next year, June 20, somebody help me out, 21, 22, 23, 24, I think, next year in Paris, the IAEA international meeting. And one of the themes might be urbanization and impacts of urbanization on energy and vice versa. That's an important issue. Thank you for your question.
Bob?
Yeah, Robert Kleinberg, Columbia University and Boston University. I'm a little perplexed about the sort of disappearance of discussion of hybrid vehicles, just to follow up on Adam's comments. Hybrid vehicles and even plug-in hybrid vehicles, which seem to solve a lot of these problems. We already have gasoline infrastructure. We could certainly considerably reduce the use of gasoline by just supplying hybrids with it. So it seems like a very, very good intermediate solution with no valley of death, no chasm. Yet I don't hear much discussion about hybrids and plug-in hybrids at meetings like this. Has it really disappeared, kind of off the radar screen?
You want me to start again? Yeah.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I wish I had a breakdown, actually, of the 2030 and 2040 electric vehicle fleet. I think a large part of that is going to be hybrids. Okay. And let me even take it beyond vehicles, which is the topic here, transportation. But I think some kind of, the analogy to the plug-in hybrid vehicle is for wind and solar is what's the backup power supply? Is it natural gas? Is it oil? Is it coal? Is it, what form of power? And maybe we should start thinking about renewables in general as a hybrid system that can take advantage of both batteries when they're appropriate, but also the access to other fuels to supply the charging if it's not a fully electric vehicle.
Yeah, I just to comment on that, I think it was Chris Niddle yesterday who said that the first 80% of decarbonization was probably practical, the last 20% was probably welfare reducing. I think we need to watch out for the welfare reducing, perfectionism.
The 80-20 rule.
Exactly.
One of the other interesting things that, this is now getting a little bit old, but I remember hearing a presentation from the chief technology energy person for Google and their efforts on autonomous vehicles. And I don't know whether they're still saying this, but about 3 years ago, Google was saying that the first generation of autonomous vehicles were going to be gasoline-powered vehicles, not electric vehicles, because of the infrastructure issues.
Just to add on the plug-in and hybrid side, I think most of the forecasts that these agencies run, they include the plug-in electric vehicles, the forecast. But just my personal perspective, when you're talking about the hybrid, I think it's inefficient, maybe in the near term, because as much as like a backup, why have two powertrains in your car? It's like two systems. And I think we should work towards enhancing technologies so that one powertrain becomes efficient rather than have, it's like belts and suspenders, right? Like why have two in one car, right? So it can play an intermediate role, but at a longer term, it's good to focus on one technology and let's get efficient.
So I think the quick commentary on that is that the hybrid vehicle addresses your range anxiety issue. And it's a small gasoline. It's not a very big gasoline engine. It's just enough of a gasoline engine to provide run the generator.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's not too powerful.
Yeah.
It's running a generator. So it's not too powerful.
John Ballantyne, Brandeis University. Just to follow up on Bob's point, going back to costs and the price of vehicles, and since we do not have the externality priced into vehicles, if Adam puts on his CFA hat, you look at the breaking point of, when you're going to get big demand for cars is at $20,000, and I just don't, the hybrids are coming down in price, the EVs are at $40,000 and $50,000, and so I guess as we look at this, and we're not making a decision based on the total cost of operating, but on the purchase price of a vehicle, how does that figure into the demand part, and what's the price? And going down your learning curve, how do you get to a $20,000 vehicle without a subsidy on the EVs?
Anyone?
I think you've actually answered your own question. But I think that there's always, from a policy perspective, we had an interesting talk yesterday about how energy economists need to think about policy from time to time too. And policymakers are really keen to look at alternatives to fossil fuel powered vehicles. And so the idea that there would be tax dollars being spent to subsidize first generation vehicles seems to make a lot of sense. I mean, from a political perspective, I think that what everybody's hoping is that the costs come down very quickly. That's that battery technology breakthrough that I think that everybody's hoping for. Final comment is that one of the interesting things in an all-electric vehicle, the powertrain. I mean, you get the cost of the powertrain and the battery down, but you still have the aluminum or steel in the vehicle, the glass, the paint that I talked about earlier, the tires, they're all the same. And you are still going to have a lot of costs of those vehicles associated with the other aspects of the transportation package.
Just to add, I think what we're seeing is the total cost of ownership is declining as we see in other technologies. I think as Adam has alluded to, the expectation is that the gap between electric vehicle and ICE, the total cost of ownership will narrow down as well. But the other feature is like eventually it's like if there is some value that we give to the low carbon side of things. And I think that's when you're looking at the total cost of ownership. If you start giving some green attributes, some benefits, then there is value in migrating towards electric vehicles.
Okay.
Thank you.
My name is Alexei. I work for Asia Pacific Energy Research Center, and I was impressed with the opening slide of the third presentation, which said, question today, imagine tomorrow, and I want to develop it into maybe we should design and engineer tomorrow, build it somewhat differently to how it's being visioned now. When we started looking at the transport sector in our work, we came across the ITF, International Transportation Forum's work on the transportation forecast. And the head of ITF openly said that only driving the technological change is not going to solve the transportation problem, such as the emissions, such as congested cities. And they've done 3 case studies for Lisbon, for Helsinki, for Auckland in New Zealand, where they further developed the shared mobility concept. It's not only Uber, but it could be like mini shuttle buses, which operate based on an app. And they showed that you can actually remove the number of vehicles needed to move people from where they are to where they want to be, using only 10 to 15% of the existing stock. So maybe we should look at the future where we don't have 2 billion vehicles on the roads. Maybe we should see the future where we have 200 million vehicles which are functioning 60, 80% of the time, as opposed to being parked 95% of the time, which is the reality right now. So could you please elaborate on that a little bit?
It's difficult to argue with your point. I think it's extremely valid. In the industry, idle asset is like, it's a no-no. But in our life, we have idle asset all the time. So I think the technology, especially the information technology, will allow that to be able to utilize your asset much more efficiently. But there's also the behavioral of people as well. Everybody wants to have his own car, so that has to change as well. Everybody has to go to work at the same time, the same thing as well. So, you know, there's no silver bullet, there's no single solution for all those problems. I think what you mentioned is absolutely true. I think it's a combination of all of these that can make it work.
Hi, I'm Mina Bibra. I work in the policy space, but at Natural Resources Canada as a public servant. So I guess from my perspective, or our perspective, we try to look at the whole energy system as a whole. When we look at it, you know, capital is limited. I guess my question to you guys is, you know, there's many competing technologies that in the light duty vehicle, medium and heavy duty vehicle space that can decarbonize on a certain trajectory. You know, from your guys' opinion, do you have advice on how, you know, with this limited capital that's available, how we would be able to strategically invest in these technologies to really maximize the GHG benefits, but also optimize the economic benefits as well?
Let me try a very broad answer to that question. I think it's, I mean, if you summarize my presentation, it's oil is still going to be playing a big role in transportation in 20 years from now. So, but we all know that carbon dioxide is a problem, so how do you deal with that? And maybe the answer is, a very popular term in conferences these days is the circular economy. And a lot of it has to do with, when it first started, it had to do with recycling. But I think that now it's really gone beyond that. It's how do you have an economy that's sustainable? And let me add another word in there: circular carbon economy. How can you have a carbon cycle that is circular in the sense that it's, you know, net zero carbon emissions, and that requires capture and storage of carbon dioxide. But it might also be thought of as ways of looking at how you minimize the carbon going into the ecosystem in the first place. You know, what's the lowest carbon fuel of the fossil fuels? How, you know, can you move people from coal towards natural gas and, you know, oil in between that? within each of those fuels, are there lower carbon alternatives? What's the easiest way to do all of that? So that then what you're coming up with is the practical solution that serves the public interest, I think, in a better way, that says if it's really impractical to completely replace or get rid of fossil fuels, how do you minimize the issues that are created by fossil fuels, and what public policy initiatives can be put in place to encourage that kind of recycling approach, which then says that, which kind of gets at the problem. The problem is not the fossil fuel itself. The problem is the emission coming from the fossil fuels, and so deal with the problem, not with what's actually providing a public good.
Just to add on a question on the investment side, and I think it's not so much the investment constraint, and I think let me take another perspective, where is how do we measure the outcomes of the investment you made? I think that's also important. I think we need the infrastructure. It kind of ties to the earlier question as well, is are we doing some responsible development on this transportation instead of going ahead with technology? One example, like when you develop in the business cases, earlier it used to be typically financial side. Maybe now it is more of the investment that you're making. You look at the triple bottom line of financial, social, and environmental aspects of the returns that investment is giving. So I'm just flipping around. It's not that, yeah, there is a capital constraint, but don't look at the outcome measures just from a financial lens. But from a social and environmental lens also need to be looked at.
Denis?
One last comment did you want something to say? It kind of is part that question, but the question before is Bob said, where are the hybrid vehicles in this scenario? One of the other things that I think seems to have gone away from the literature, and I haven't seen much about it, but I always thought it was very intriguing, is what could you do with the batteries that are in all of these electric vehicles during the day when they're in the car park? Right? Like, can they be hooked up to the grid? Can they be used to supplement, it's like, and to supplement the electric needs? In Saudi Arabia, for example, I mean, it's like your highest electric use is during the day for air conditioning, and if you could figure out some way to use batteries to supplement whatever fuels are being used to generate that electricity during the day, I could see the value of it. And if we're going to have a huge number of electric vehicles, finding something to do with the batteries in those vehicles, and even when they're done, as the idea of the used battery being supplemental power for households once they're no longer appropriate from a recharging standpoint for vehicles would be interesting.
I've actually always had a problem with exactly that idea of the daytime use, because if you already have range anxiety, how much of your battery do you want to sell during the day? Yeah. You wouldn't be able to make sure you can at least get home again, right? So I've never really, I've never really seen that as the selling point that I often hear it as. Like, I'm not going to give you any of my electricity. I want to be able to make sure I can get home.
Free Uber rides.
There we go.
Free Uber rides if your battery's been drained.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question.
Okay, so Peter Hartley, Rice University. I have a question for Denis. I mean, how does the cost of your ethanol compare to the cost of ethanol from corn, let's say? And does your cost include, say, a payment from the waste disposal person for you to get rid of their waste? And if we had charges on the ethanol for some of the externalities associated with it, like the problems with the Gulf of Mexico, the fertilizer getting in there, and so forth, would that make the cost of your ethanol more similar, more competitive with theirs?
I will say that at the scale that we are, And I think you brought a good point, which I did not mention, but the feedstock, it's a negative value. So we are getting paid for the feedstock. As an example, in Edmonton, every ton that comes in, we're getting paid about $55 per ton. So obviously it helps the economics. In general, on our revenue side, the feedstock is contribute to 10 to 15%. At the size of our capacity, we can compete with the corn ethanol pricing as far as cash costs. Yes, so we're getting there. The technology is new. We see improvement coming in the pipeline, but yes, we are competing. Yeah.
Well, would you please join me in thanking our speakers? I think it was a really good discussion. Thank you.